Hey everybody, so I wanted to do a little video here on backbudding, and it's kind of like the design videos, and I'm going to use the iPad, but it's a different type of concept here. So I will make a quick note that a lot of the things I'm going to say today are general backbudding principles as far as why we want them, and then the general ideas of how we get them, but I am going to try to do some species-dependent videos of a similar type later on, including pines and some of the deciduous trees and stuff like that. But before I jump into any of the hows, I thought I would talk about why. And so if you look at the drawing I have here, I'm going to make a reference to that. But why might we want backbudding? So the reasons I came up with, there's a lot of them, but it's if you stick around long enough in the bonsai world, you know everyone wants backbudding and driving it and figuring out how to do it and all that kind of stuff. Why do they want that? Why is it such a desirable thing? So one of the things that it allows us to do is it allows us more branching options as we start to develop our tree. So on the left here, we have a branch that's fairly weak, fairly few buds, and the buds that are strong are out toward the tip. So I will say that the the size of the buds in these drawings does matter. That's not just an arbitrary thing that I've made some of them small and some of them large. If they're big, that means that they're strong, and if they're small, that means that they're weak. So if I were to try to develop a branch over here on the left, I have fewer options. Compare that over here on the right, I actually have the luxury of removing some of the buds that are in non-optimal locations. So just to make sure you're oriented, this is looking down from the top of the tree down onto the tops of the branches. So I have the trunk labeled there in the bottom corner. So if I'm looking at that and I say, okay, I want to go in and I only want to have branches, new branches on the outsides of curves. Well, on the left-hand branch, I don't really have many options, but on the right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to erase a few of the branches here, or the buds here, I should say. And I could prune those off, let them grow into branches and then prune them off, or I could just knock the bud off, if the tree is pretty strong. So like, let's say I want to take everything off that's on the inside of a curve. I'm going to do that here. I'm going to do that here. And then suddenly I still have more buds than I even have on the left-hand branch, but I have them over here on more optimal locations. So that's one, is that gives you more branching options. And so what I mean by that, if you're not familiar, the buds will grow out to become branchlets, which will then become branches. And so this one here could go out here, this one here can go out here, this one here can go out here. So this brings us to another thing that the multiple back buds allows us to do, which is to think about building structure on our tree in ways that we want. And so again, if we let those grow out the way that I've drawn them there, well, they're eventually going to form buds on here as well. The more buds we have, the more options we have for developing our structure. And this is kind of how we start to develop ramification, that the tricky word there. Ramification just means branching. If, again, on the left-hand branch over here, we would probably have to cut way, way back, and it's going to take us a lot longer to start and develop that, as opposed to something where we have some buds to choose from in the first place. So another reason why we might want backbuds is that it gives us the option for developing some taper. Taper is where, in general, it's like the difference. So if you look at like a cylinder, like a Pringles can, it's straight, totally straight. That doesn't have much taper. Compare that to a traffic cone, starts thick at the base and gets thinner and thinner toward the top. That is what we consider taper. So generally moving from thicker to thinner. Backbuds allow us that option as well. And so if I go back to my my white color here, I can, let's shrink it back down. Sorry about that. I can get rid of all of this. Maybe it's a little bigger. I can get rid of all of this, cut back to here. And now as I grow this branch out on the right here, the one that's out of this bud, it will get thicker. And as this branch gets thicker, we now then start to develop this nice kind of tapered branch out toward the tip. So that's another reason why people might want some backbuds. And I would say the last thing, and it relates to what we just did there, more backbuds allow us to compress our design. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the full tree model here. But generally speaking, if we take our two options and we cut them back to the same thing here, if we've compressed the design, we've brought it in, which of these two offers us more options to start developing more quickly? Obviously, it's the one on the right that has more backbudding. So I think one quick thing to mention is this I would say generally kind of looks like a deciduous tree. It's supposed to be just a generic tree, but there are people who will grow a tree to a certain size, thickness, get the trunk to the size that they want, and then they will come and they will just cut the whole branch all the way back, under the assumption that the deciduous tree will send out buds from the trunk, and then they'll start. Oops, they won't be that large. The assumption that they'll start developing branches out from there, and they'll thicken over time. That is something that is done, but in general, I'm trying to move toward more getting the structure in place at every step along the way as much as possible, including the backbudding, so that I don't have to start from the trunk. I can actually develop the trunk and the branches simultaneously. So if that went over your head, or that's outside of what your expectation or your understanding, don't worry about it. The general idea here is that we want to usually try to be cutting back to a bud in most contexts. So that's the kind of the branch view. To toggle that off to kind of show us why we might want backbudding. And I'm going to go over to a different view, which is actually our full tree view here. And I'm going to I'll orient you to this real quick, and then I'll pop over to a couple other drawings that I have here. So this is just a general side view of a tree, young tree. The green here represents either the ground that it's planted in, or it could be in a pot, doesn't matter. But the idea here is, okay, what are we thinking about within the physiology of the overall tree that allows for backbudding to happen and or prevents backbudding from happening in the first place? So you have to understand that in a bonsai context, we're operating in some ways against the natural impulses and goals of the tree as an organism. And so what I mean by that is, if I show you the quote unquote normal view of what how a young tree might develop, working off that same trunk, a young tree is going to just shoot out branches all over the place. And you can see the sun, the orange thing up here in the corner is the sun. It's responding in part to light effects. And it's also trying to maximize its ability to photosynthesize and collect sugars to then be able to build vascular tissue and overall strength and get bigger and bigger over time. So trees want to be big trees. What that ends up resulting in is that you could see the dark. Make sure I'm on a scratch layer here. The dark red, the dark red here is still. Those are still buds that are strong, and then there's a bunch of little buds on the inside that are weak. Over time, as the tree attempts to expand upward and outward, what's going to end up happening is it's going to create, not a perfect one, but it's going to create this kind of dense foliage dome around the outside. Now, this is just a demonstration, so this is theoretically a tree that has been cut right down the middle. If this were a real tree, it would have foliage in front and we wouldn't be able to see it. But since we're taking a cross-sectional slice, if you were to go and step up inside this tree or look inside this tree, which is developing again in a normal context, just trying to stretch out toward the sun, trying to stretch out to the sides in order to get access to more and more sunlight, more and more carbon dioxide to be able to turn both of those into sugars and oxygen. What this dense layer of foliage creates is efficient solar panels, but it also creates a lot of shade on the interior of the tree. Now, for the tree, that's not a problem at all because its goal is to get bigger, its goal is to survive, its goal is to reproduce. Now, I say goal here, I'm not trying to anthropomorphize, I'm just putting it in terms that I think help us to understand. But what we see on the inside here are a bunch of branches, which I think you could think of as representing the tree's attempts to develop branching that weren't as successful. And then and so that's all these little, spindly branches on the inside with really weak buds. Over time, the tree has no loyalties to any of those branches. The branches are only there to help it survive. If they're not helping it survive, it will just cut off resources, drop the branch, and kill it. So these longer branches that have stretched out have buds at the tip. And if you notice, if we were to go back and look at the branch example earlier, the branch graphic, this is the type of branches that was. It has really, really strong growth and buds at the tip and not so much further back. So the reason why is because the light exposure of those areas is greater, but there's also some hormonal reasons for why that is. So when a tree is growing upward, it wants to put as much energy as it can into extending that branch tip to make itself a larger tree and or a tree with a larger canopy. When there is something that happens that either changes the branch angle or exposes sunlight to other parts of the tree, suddenly it will put energy into those areas as well, which is something that we're trying to end up doing within bonsai. This is the natural model for how a tree was going to operate. What we want to do is we want to understand it, react to it, and manipulate it, which teaches us then in turn how to make backbuds. So if I go and I turn off these two layers, contrast what we were just looking at. So we were just looking at this version. Contrast that with a bonsai canopy. So obviously it's much smaller, much denser. If you don't have any reference for scale, in many ways it makes this tree look much larger. The branching is finer, and there's a couple other differences as well. And so this is where I'll start to talk about how we might think about building backbuds. The number one thing that you can do to promote backbuds, regardless of what type of tree it is, regardless of the age of the tree even, is to build the vigor within the tree. Build the strength with which it's growing, the speed with which it's growing, give it lots of fertilizer, and let the branch tips run as much as possible. So this is a developmental technique. This obviously is not reflected in this tree that you have before you here, but that is the one thing that you can do to promote backbudding in general. We always want to intervene and do something and have this sense that I cut that, therefore those buds grew. That does happen sometimes. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but there's a little bit more of a hands-off, holistic approach to backbudding that I think will benefit us in the long run, particularly with species where we can't cut to a spot and things will just grow, like a pine, for instance, is that if we can allow for some vigor to build up within the tree will end up developing backbuds more readily. Another thing that we're going to need to do, remember we had the big, let's see. We had the big shade dome on the last one, right? Well, we've clearly gotten rid of that, and we have exposed areas inside the canopy to more sunlight, which has allowed for more buds to develop. So one thing that we can do to promote backbuds beyond just building vigor is to expose those branches to more light through reducing the amount of foliage that's on the outside or the top or whatever of the canopy. It could be reducing just the foliage from the branches that exist. It could also be removing entire branches, in some cases strategically pruning to open up the canopy and allow more light in. Promotion of those internal buds that either already exist or that we're trying to promote developing into backbuds is one of those key concepts for why we do things like partial defoliation, in-season pruning, even things like decandling can factor into that. Another thing that we can do, if we notice the difference between the other tree and this one, there aren't a lot of branches that are growing up like this. The branches in this case are growing more like this in general. And the reason why that is a strategy that we do. So we either prune and or wire in order for this to happen. So I mentioned earlier something that when you have a branch that's growing up, like this one, it's going to put a lot of resources into the tip. That is primarily communicated through a hormone called auxin. And so auxin is the hormone that is being produced and sent around in order to make a tree big and leggy and long, and in some cases thicker. So it's the growth mindset, so to speak. When we take and we lay a branch down, like in the case of this branch, we tend to suppress the auxin that's at the tip because it's not facing up toward the sun. It's not facing this way. And rather, we've exposed this entire portion of the branch to the sun, which will then promote these branches to maybe potentially grow up, back buds to develop on that branch to grow up. But it also suppresses the auxin here at the tip in favor of this other hormone called cytokinin, which tends to promote things that are more like dense, bushy growth. More foliar development further back. This is all like a simplification if there's any plant physiologists out there. But this is, I think, sound information in terms of strategy particularly. And so, if we get rid of all those, again, we can see that these branches tend to go out to the side. So laying a branch down is another way to promote backbudding in that branch. It exposes it to more light. It usually allows for it to have more exposure to carbon dioxide, and it also has a hormonal effect. I mentioned already the idea of removing foliage. This is kind of the last one that I'll mention here. Removing foliage to promote light penetration into the canopy. So getting rid of the dome in favor of shorter branching that allows light to come in all these various locations. That's awesome. Another effect of removing foliar mass, another effect that can have, removing leaves, removing needles, particularly during the growing season, during particular windows, is that as the tree has sent out all of this foliage and it's kind of prepared itself and it has a sense of how this season is going to go according to how much nutrient is getting moved and how much sunlight exposure, all that kind of stuff, plant intelligence to put it human terms on it. If you go and remove a large number of the solar panels that were on the tree in the first place, what can happen is it can tell the tree, we are not going to have nearly enough sugars and starches according to what we were going to try to do, so we're going to put out a bunch of new growth. That could either be activating, in most cases it is activating, buds that you can see, or in some cases growing buds that you are at dormant sites that you couldn't see before. And so I think sometimes this is described as reducing the sugars or reducing the starch, the sugar starch deprivation process. There's a really interesting podcast Ryan Neal did with Telperion, people who are developing trees. And this is one of the ways that they promoted backbuds on their Japanese black pines is by removing some of the needles on like their sacrifice branches, for instance. And that actually promoted some of the backbudding. So in other words, think about if you love tomatoes and you have a garden and you put out 10 tomato plants because you love tomatoes and you're expecting tomatoes. And if a hailstorm rolls in early summer and knocks out 3/4 of your tomatoes, if you have the resources, if you have the energy, and if you have the time, you are probably going to put out more tomato plants to replace those things. It's kind of the similar thing that we're doing with the foliar reduction. These are sugar factories for this tree. We're going to take away the sugar factories. It's going to try to replace its sugar factories by putting out new buds, new foliage. This has implications for foliar size reduction, but in the case of backbudding, and in the case of bud promotion in general, it can have a huge effect. So I think those are some of the main, just to recap on the how, building vigor in the tree is the number one thing. A young tree is one that's looking to set up franchises. It's looking to put its energy out. A vigorous tree, a healthy tree, is trying to put out as many branches and branchlets and possibilities as it can to collect sunlight. So build the vigor in your tree, backbudding will be more likely. Take the branch and lay it down, expose it to sunlight, and play with the hormonal dynamics within the branch. As the sun is exposed to those back buds, as the hormonal balancing act of the tree happens, it will activate those back buds and grow from those sites. The last thing is remove foliage, both in order to expose lower branches to light and promote weak buds and also dormant back buds to develop. But also do that during strategic times of year. And I'm going to talk again about specific trees and specific types of actions in later videos. But if you do those during the right times of year, it actually can trigger a second response from the tree to promote and develop some of those buds further back on the tree. So again, this is a general principles of backbudding video. It's not supposed to be here's how you get them on your Japanese black pine, but I think that there are techniques for doing that. If you have questions or comments, or this fits with what you're thinking, or this is something new to you, or you have some disagreement, or you've had different experiences, please let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't liked and subscribed, please do that. And I will see you in the next video.